I'm joined today by Eitan Paled, the Programming Director of Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA, and Philippe Assouline, who is an international relations expert. Eitan is a supporter of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement known as BDS, and Philippe is an opponent of that movement. Eitan, I want to start with you. You support this movement, so I want to first hear from you what the goals are of the movement and why you support it.
Yes, I am a supporter of the BDS movement. And I think that when you talk about the BDS movement, it's with most things with regards to this issue, it's important to contextualize it. So the history of the peace process, as it's called, between the Israelis and the Palestinians has seen a long history of a failure to attain what is a just peace. And throughout the history of Israel, it doesn't matter whether the prime minister was left-leaning, was right-leaning. There is a consistent history of settlements being built, of injustices being perpetuated, and the BDS movement and supporters such as me are basically sick and tired of waiting for the next negotiation to fail. So we've resorted to the BDS movement, which calls for boycotting, divesting from, and imposing sanctions on the state of Israel until three conditions are met. And the first condition is an end to the occupation. The second condition is for there to be equal rights for Palestinians in Israel. And the third condition is known as the right of return, or as I like to call it, the call for a just solution to the refugee situation.
Okay, so Philippe, you've heard from Eitan there why it is that he is a supporter of the BDS movement and the 3 points that he has stated as the sort of goals for BDS. Talk now about your interpretation of those goals and whether you believe that this is a path towards peace, away from it, or neither, I guess, is the question.
So thank you for the question. Thank you for having me. Here's the deal. I study the role and the influence of propaganda, emotional propaganda in particular, on intractable conflicts. It's why I went back to school, and my personal belief, and I hope I can prove this, is that you can use communication not just to harm relations between two groups of people, as history has shown has happened thousands of times. You can usually hopefully use communication to bring people together. And in particular, in this conflict where it's sorely needed, this is conflict that I'm very close to. I know a lot of people who've suffered through it. The BDS movement presents itself as a human rights movement. And I believe the people on campus, such as Eitan, are sincerely driven by a desire to make things better. But I do think they're victims of a higher structure. This has been going on for a very long time, for decades now, that is using the language of human rights and the device of BDS to promote anti-Israel demonization. And what demonization does is justify violence, and it brings the sides farther apart. It doesn't just poison relations on campus. I taught this class as an instructor, as a TA at UCLA, the Arab-Israeli conflict. You can bring people together while they disagree and really create bridges, and it's inspiring, as opposed to what's happening on campuses because of groups like SJP and BDS, who, if not professed in practice, are actually hate groups, and I'll explain to you why.
Please.
And the result of BDS is bringing the sides farther apart here and there. So Eitan was speaking about contextualization, but then he goes and says, we're fed up and we want to impose this solution on Israel. So first of all, there's a complete lack of humility there that people in California and the unprecedented comfort of North America would impose a solution on people halfway across the world who have to deal with terrorism and evil for 100 years and suffering, and barely a family not affected there, okay? Second of all, is a complete disregard and writing roughshod over history. The Israelis and the Palestinians have been negotiating for a long time, as Eitan said. What he didn't say is that the Palestinians have rejected a number of almost 100% to 100% land for peace offers, okay? This is beyond doubt in any reasonable circle. This is attested by every historian, and even the Palestinians themselves say it. Even if that were not the case, the idea that privileged students in California would come impose what they think is right on other people who are going to have to pay the price via a completely one-sided narrative is, I think, morally reprehensible. And number two, it is based on this narrative that was said by other organizations that's being pumped to campuses through the SJP that is false. They're selling lies to people. I think the students actually believe it on campus. I think they're doing their best. They're being confronted with a story of injustice. I don't blame them. I don't blame Eitan. But the people at the top who are pumping out this narrative know what they're doing, and it's a narrative based almost entirely on distortions and lies. And we
So
can go
let's give Eitan a chance to respond to
Yes.
that, because there is a lot there. Eitan, go ahead.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. He did say a lot. And first, I'll contextualize and dispute this notion that those of us that are here, and this assumption that he's making, that those of us that are part of the BDS movement are unaffected by what's going on in Israel and in the Palestinian territories. So first of all, I am Israeli American, so I'm a dual citizen. My family are there Israelis, and a lot of the students in SJP are Palestinian. So we have here, as you were talking about, you want to promote communications between Israelis and Palestinians. That is what we're doing. I'm an Israeli. I have many Palestinian counterparts that are here. Another point that he mentioned that I'd like to discuss is this idea that there are ideas being pumped into SJP. There's no umbrella SJP that pumps into the SJP chapters.
Yes,
Each chapter is its own. We don't report. We don't hear from others. We do have our resources that we go to. And yes, you mentioned the class that you taught, and I was a part of that class. I was actually in that class. And one thing that class, I was not. No, I was in Megan's section. And one thing that I learned from that class is that throughout the negotiations, whether it was left or right, they'd go and in order just to negotiate, they would have to concede some settlements, which I think is a barrier to the peace process. And another point that you mentioned is that the BDS is divisive and that it promotes terrorism. I think you said something like that. Not promotes it, but incites it. And I think an important distinction to make is that the occupation is what is divisive. Occupation is divisive. Oppression is divisive. Occupation is what breeds terrorism, not the BDS movement. The BDS movement is part of the nonviolent resistance movement that the Palestinians have adopted.
Okay, so let's pause there. I think this is a good point. In the interest of sort of focusing in as specifically as possible on BDS, Philippe, I would love for you to respond to some of the specifics that Eitan mentioned there with regard to whether or not BDS is divisive. You indicated that it is. It would be great to hear from you specifically how. And number two, this issue of whether BDS is in some way connected to violence, whether it's, inciting or directly, indirectly. Is there any connection that you see between BDS and violence?
Okay, so I did not say that it incites terrorism at all. I don't think BDS incites terrorism. I do think it ends up operating as a kind of defense attorney for terrorism. And you'll see Students for Justice in Palestine often, in a very kind of insulting way, while they're condemning Israel for supposedly targeting children, which it doesn't, will at the same time call terrorist attacks that target children explicitly and openly resistance. All right, so things like that. But I don't think it incites terrorism or it's the cause of terrorism at all. Now, how is it divisive? I'll tell you the methods they use. So Eitan's opinions, a lot of them can be discussed. I think he makes some points that are very interesting and worthy of discussion. That is not at all my point. We can disagree on what Israel should do or should not be doing, what the situation is based on, and I would welcome that conversation. What BDS does is not come and educate people, or SJP, they're basically two vehicles of the same project. They don't come and educate people. What they do in practice, and I've been watching them and opposing them since 1997 in Montreal, one of the first places where this started. They go to every minority group and desecrate sacred histories, defile them to generate hostility to Jews and the Jews who support Israel, which is the overwhelming majority. And they like to get Jews to do it for them because it kind of kosherizes the whole thing. And so they'll go to people who are sensitive about racism and say, you care about apartheid? Israel's guilty of apartheid. We're victims of apartheid. You're Mexican students who have issues with migrant parents and you're going through a difficulty with that? We also have to deal with offense. Complete obliteration of context, trigger words, trigger narratives to get people to emotionally be hostile to Israel, to start identifying Israel with their own enemy. Rosa Parks, now the Palestinian movement and group, I've seen this in some SJP displays, or people calling Jesus a Palestinian. There are protests now that are closely affiliated with this quote-unquote non-violent movement, because in Israel, when there's protests, they are quite violent sometimes. For example, with the fence, in Israel, I said, with the fence, Santa, okay, they're dressing up as Santa this week. They've presented themselves as fighting for civil rights. Like it's not a question of educating people and having them have a nuanced discussion about what's going on and what should be done. It's about equating for every minority group, including Jews, they'll use the Holocaust, equating Israel with their enemies in an emotional way, which you can't really have any nuanced discussion with after.
Okay, let's pause there, Philippe. In the interest of sort of keeping it flowing, let's allow Eitan to respond to what you've said.
Okay, so a couple things. So first of all, at the beginning you talked about defending terrorism and calling it resistance. So there is a difference between the resistance that the Palestinians are doing in response to the occupation and the IDF terrorism. When they go in, whether it's the administrative detentions or the night raids, nobody in SJP walks around with a Hamas shirt. People in Bruins for Israel is the name of the pro-Israel group at UCLA, for example. They walk around with shirts that say Israeli Defense Forces. I mean, that is defense for terrorism by definition. And then to your other point about the building of coalitions amongst the minority groups. So I see Israel and its formation, and this is actually something that you taught in the class. You talked about the expulsion of some of the Palestinians as a settler colonial state. There were these Europeans that came in. These are actually my grandfather and my great-grandfather that came in and did this and forcibly removed these Palestinians and then formed the state that they did. And so what we do is we talk about these narratives.
That's not what I taught.
Well, you taught that there were people forcibly removed, and that is part one of settler colonialism. And another point that you mentioned is the nonviolent protests that go on in the West Bank every Friday. And I invite you to come to one with me. I have been to one. They are completely nonviolent. I went, and it was actually in the village of Al-Ma'asara. This was a Palestinian farming village who are cut off from their farming lands by the Israelis so that they could build a settlement. And so every Friday, they try to walk to these lands that were taken from them, completely nonviolent. They don't have any weapons. This is men, women, and children. I was actually there to teach a karate class to the children at the protest so that they don't throw rocks. They put on events at the protests. And you go and you come across this wall of Israeli soldiers. And within 10 minutes, this is completely nonviolent. The Israeli soldiers were shooting tear gas and they were shooting shock grenades at us, at me, at the men that were there, at the children that were there. It is brutal. And the protesters, again, I say they are nonviolent. So don't try to paint them as these violent. Sometimes whether they dress up as Santa Claus, whether they dress up, whatever they dress up as, it is nonviolent. And that is the main point, and that they're being brutally suppressed.
Okay, let's pause there. I'll remind you we're speaking with Eitan Peled, Programming Director of Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA, and Philippe Assouline, an international relations expert. We will pause and then continue with both of them. We're continuing our conversation with Eitan Peled, Programming Director of Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA, and international relations expert Philippe Assouline. Philippe, we started the first section with Eitan. I want to start with you in this section. When you think about BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions movement, what is your primary concern with regard to the future? You've talked a lot about what it is that concerns you about their specific actions, but with regard to the future, where are you most concerned with the BDS movement?
Good. So there's two things. On the one hand, like as I was saying, my personal bet, assumption, hope is that communication can bring the parties on the ground in Israel and the Palestinians together and reach an actual peace that is sustainable. I think BDS is an engine of hatred and irredentism. BDS, SJP, all these affiliated movements that create a sense in the world that the Palestinians are these uniquely aggrieved victims that they should not compromise. BDS is officially anti-normalization. And it generates a sense in the Palestinian community that there needs to be no compromise. They just need to wait, and Israel will eventually either be defeated or forced into concessions that it cannot make, and everything. They will get everything without giving anything. And that's not how peace happens. I actually want peace to happen. I have somewhat of a TV, internet-based program where I try to promote, nuanced middle views. And BDS and SJP, they just come destroy that. The second one that bugs me is that there's a moral inversion. If you were hearing about what Eitan was saying before, he has no problem calling groups like Hamas or Fatah, which openly target children. And now they're using child soldiers, basically, to target Israeli children, to stab them, to kill them, to blow them up. He said they were resistance, but the real terrorists are the IDF, and that people who wear IDF T-shirts are supporting terrorism. So the gall of equating an army from a democratic state that is subject to a Supreme Court, that is targeting terrorists, that is repeatedly, by anybody who has any military expertise, commended for the efforts it makes, if not the results, and equating that, not even equating that, making it seem like it's worse than a terrorist group that is driven openly by jihadi ambitions to kill Jews, as Jews, not even Israelis. That's the Hamas charter, or Fatah, that celebrates children killing children. And you can go, your viewers should go to palwatch.org, PALWATCH.org, and see the mountain of incitement of drugging children with hatred to kill people. The moral inversion of ignoring that and making Israel into the problem is a problem in and of itself, apart from the impediment it presents to the peace process.
Okay, so I would love to hear you, Eitan, address a couple of the specific claims Philippe made. Number one, are actions by Hamas and Fatah ever legitimate resistance in your mind?
Well, first, I want to clarify something that he was saying. So let's talk about what terrorism is. It comes from to terrorize. I think whether it is the U.S. military in Iraq, whether it's the IDF in Gaza, or whether it's Hamas militants, that is terrorism. That violence, that attempt to kill, that is terrorism by definition.
No, not by definition.
As far as I'm concerned.
There is a definition.
As far as I'm concerned, from
but
whether
you
it
could
comes
be
from to
concerned about
terrorize.
whatever you want.
And another point that I want to make is his calling the IDF this sort of moral army. If you look at people like organizations like Amnesty International, they have come out with these reports of the brutalization that the IDF has subjected the Palestinians to, as what I would see as terrorism, indeed.
So, but to the question, are militant actions by Hamas or Fatah ever legitimate resistance in your mind?
Yes, I would say that they are. They are resistance to the occupation. They are resistance to the blockade. When you have a system of oppression, when you have a system of occupation, you're going to have the Panthers and you're going to have the MLK. You're going to have the nonviolent and you're going to have the violent resistance. That is the violent resistance. The BDS movement is separate from that, and it is part of the nonviolent resistance, and that is what I associate myself with.
Okay, so I'm glad that you were clear about that. Now, the next question I have, based on what Philippe said, is: are there concessions that you, as someone who is part of SJP and the pro-BDS side, would be willing to make in order to achieve a lasting peace? Philippe said BDS is not willing to make concessions. Are there concessions you are willing to make? And if so, specifically, what are they?
Well, I think as far as concessions go, the BDS movement calls for three things that I think are not compromisable. For example, you don't make a compromise when it comes to racism and apartheid, and
notice the trigger words.
And when it comes to racism and apartheid and different laws for different people. So when you have a group of people that is being discriminated against legally, and you talked about the Israeli Supreme Court, they uphold laws such as those that allow for the Israeli community to discriminate against people who don't fit the local community, not being allowed to live there. So basically, the promotion of Jewish-only housing.
But Eitan, are there compromises are there concessions you would be willing to make?
Sorry?
Are there concessions you would be willing to make? I guess you're restating the three things that are not negotiable, but what concessions would you be willing to make?
Well, could you give me some examples of some concessions that you'd like there to be made?
There's no concessions I'm looking for. I guess my question is, in imagining how we might go towards a lasting peace, there's the three things you've been very clear on that would not be negotiable, but what would you imagine that could be offered that would be acceptable to you in the interest of going towards a lasting peace?
Again, I'm not quite sure I understand the hypothetical. I'll talk about.
It's not a hypothetical. You're talking about supposedly reaching a fair solution,
sure.
And all you do is use these incendiary trigger words that distort the conversation to talk about racism and point to Israel and the Middle East, to say MLK and the Panthers. You've shut down debate. Those equations you've made, those analogies are insulting to anybody who knows anything about the civil rights movement and about Israel. If you're going to worry about racism, you should worry about the West Bank and the Palestinian Authority. But either way, you're talking about supposedly a solution, and all you're doing is smearing and defaming Israel. What do you see as a solution? What rights do Israelis have here in your mind?
Every right. They have every right to live in peace. My cousins that are living there, they have every right to the freedoms that we are fighting for the Palestinians to have. The idea here, the reason I am part of an
self-defense?
Self-defense?
Yes.
Well, then we're getting into an entirely different philosophical debate about a nation's right to defend and the right to kill people.
Stop suicide bombers. When you put a fence to stop suicide
what about
bombers,
defense
it's
against
philosophical
occupation?
for you.
We're talking defense against occupation. We're talking defense against the military assaults on Gaza.
This is a complete, absolute emotional distortion. What does that mean, defense against occupation? What does that mean? What does that mean, defense occupation? You want to kill Israeli soldiers until Israel is forced to leave? Is that what defense against occupation means? Or is it terrorist attacks until Israel is forced to leave? Because Israel even withdrew unilaterally from Gaza, and it stayed because of terrorism. What do you make of the offers, the many offers that the Palestinians were given? You get here all the land you say you want, just agree to end the conflict, and they said no over and over again. What does it mean in that context, defense against occupation, if not just an emotional distortion to turn people against Israel illegitimately?
Let Eitan respond to that.
Well, I think that BDS is a sort of defense against occupation. I think this nonviolent resistance is the best way to defend against it. And it's important to remember that SJP, excuse me, SJP, there's no political stance here taken on one state, two state, three state, where the lines are drawn. It's a human rights concern. It's about allowing for Palestinians to have the same equal rights that the Israelis have. That is my concern.
The Palestinians are run by their own authority because that's what they fought for. The Palestinians in Israel, Israeli Arabs.
Let's remember that.
Hold on, let Philippe speak.
They're given this quasi authority where Israel actually has a military presence with IDF soldiers in what is supposed to be the Palestinian Authority's area in Gaza that the Palestinians are supposed to control. The Israeli controls the airspace, they control the borders, and they control the maritime trade.
That's what happens in the world of grown-ups when you choose to wage war instead of accepting peace offers. Now, for you to look at the Middle East in the state it's in now, or in any condition in the last 70 years, and to point to Israel, the only country trying to cling to liberal values and doing quite a good job based on the threats it's facing, and to point to that, and to say that's racism, it doesn't fit with me here in California, is vulgar. It might work on campus, it doesn't work in reality. The Palestinians have rejected at least 7 offers of the first state they could have ever had in history. 7. There's no other example of that in history. They've rejected 3 peace offers plus unilateral withdrawal. That's 4. In the last 15 years, the reason they do that is because they're being told by the world, because of organizations such as yours, that they don't need to compromise, that if they just keep waiting, people will justify terrorism for them, they will keep pressuring Israel through all kinds of means, and Israel will be forced to unilaterally withdraw. Israel's not going to commit suicide. Israel has every right to be there. It has a right to a state legally, morally, and the occupation endures because the Palestinians have rejected peace offers, and they've waged violence on Israel.
Well,
okay, Eitan, we are starting to sort of get towards the end of our time today, so I would love to hear again, and Eitan, I want to give you the opportunity to say, what do you, there's much more, there's no question that there's much more to discuss here. I would love to hear from you what you envision to be the future of the region that currently is Israel, including Gaza and the West Bank. What do you envision that to look like in an ideal world, in a world that would align with the ideas of SJP and BDS?
Well, first, I just want to make a quick comment that he contextualized Israel with in the rest of the Middle East. So Israel, as organizations like the ones that Mr. Assouline are a part of, love to call Israel the democracy that it is.
What organization am I part of?
Stand With Us. So you're not?
No. I sometimes do things with them, but I'm not.
Okay, anyways, Mr. Assouline himself, he called it this democracy with liberal values. The reason that that is what makes it a good target for BDS is when you boycott the electorate, the hope is that the electorate will elect officials that will end the occupation and allow for these types of programs. And again, the future that I see, I want equal rights for Palestinians. I want them to have the same access to resources that the Israelis have. I want them to have the same freedom of movement that Israelis have, the same access to water. Again, resources that that Israelis have. And obviously, I hope for peace, whether that's one state, whether that's two states. That matters less to me
One state
than for there to
is
be
peace to you?
equality. I'm sorry?
That's a fair question, though, Eitan. Is BDS in favor? Is BDS equally open to a one or two state solution, or is it mostly
Correct.
interested in a one state solution?
It does not take a stance on one state versus
That's
two
false.
state solution.
The
No.
goals you outlined, at the beginning, okay? The supposed right of return would turn Israel into what Syria is now.
That's not
And
true.
Barghouti-
Well, hold on.
Omar
Let me explain.
Barghouti-
Please let me
Omar
explain,
Barghouti
because that's
repeatedly
false. Let me
said-
explain the right
I'll
of return.
finish my sentence in a second. Omar Barghouti, the founder of BDS, who happens to study at Tel Aviv University, or studied there, to just express the hypocrisy here. He himself is on record multiple times as saying he opposes a two-state solution. He wants a one state. That means in some imaginary universe, there is this legal right that doesn't exist actually to bring back 4 or 5 million people who have never been there, but their grandparents were. And then you create a binational state with two populations that have faced hostility for 100 years. And this is their solution for equality, a mass slaughter. You're going to end up with Syria. And this is what they want from California, from the campus. This is what's going to make them feel nice.
Excuse me, you're also sitting in California making this debate. I was probably in
I'm
Israel
not
more
calling for
recently than
people
you.
to risk their lives so that I can sound interesting to my colleagues on campus.
Yes,
I'm
you
not
are. That's
calling
exactly
for
what you're doing.
No, I'm not. Did I?
Hold on.
Did you?
Well, let
say I
me
wanted to
take this
impose
back for a
solution?
second. Let's talk about the right of return and its interpretations. And again, as I said at the beginning of this segment, I interpret it as a just solution to the refugee problem.
What's it?
Whether-
What is it?
Hold on, Philippe. Let's let him explain what he does mean by right of return. I think that's
Whether-
important.
whether that's reparations for those that were expelled and forcibly removed from their homes, something needs to be done. Right now, they're living as stateless people in the borders of the neighboring Arab states with nothing. They grow up, they go to school, and they can't get visas. They can't get jobs because they can't get
Why
visas.
is that Israel's
They're not
fault?
citizens. Because Israel is the one who expelled these people from their homes.
No, it's not. You didn't
You
listen
taught that
to
in the class,
No,
that
I'll
they
tell you what
forcibly
I taught-
removed the
okay.
people, and these are the descendants of those people.
That's what you wanted to hear. I'll tell you what I taught in the class in 2 minutes. I'll tell you what I taught in the class. Okay?
You
peace
taught,
offer was.
excuse me,
I'll
just
tell
please
you.
let me
I'm
finish my
happy to
point
do
here.
it.
Just quickly,
Let's let him
my
finish.
point.
Let's let him finish.
You're distorting what I supposedly taught. I'll tell you who was expelled and who wasn't. I have
Some
nothing
people-
to hide
Some people were expelled,
on both sides.
and some people were fled in fear of being expelled. That makes them refugees.
No, not in fear of being expelled.
Yes, that is why they left. When you have a community that is
I would like
pillaging,
to
and this is
people
this
to
is the
say what I
palmach, this is the
thought.
palmach that my grandpa was actually a part of, going in and pillaging these villages, and the neighboring village hears of it, they're going to
You
do
think
the
that's
smart
what I
thing
thought?
and get out with the hopes of coming back.
Okay,
And those
I hate
people
to
were not allowed
interrupt
back.
here. I hate to interrupt here, but we have, without having resolved anything, of course, reached the end of our time today. And without question, this is indicative of how much there is to discuss here and how controversial this issue is. And without trying to stifle debate, I will welcome both of you back onto the program anytime. And if we want to pick very specific points, we had a sort of broad focus today. If we want to be more specific in what we want to attack next time, I am more than happy to do that. But we have reached the end of our time for today. I've been with Eitan Peled, the programming director of Students for Justice in Palestine at UCLA, and Philippe Assouline, who is an international relations expert. I thank you both for joining me today, and I welcome you both back absolutely anytime.
Thank you very
Thank
much
you
for
for having
having me, and I look forward to that opportunity.